Hi everyone. So in this video I want to talk about estimating in Agile. It's one of the things that people who are brand new to Agile get confused about all the time, and it's actually quite simple, but it takes a little bit of getting your head around. So let's start by talking about some Agile story points. Agile story points are completely separate from the idea of time, of effort, of anything like that you've previously estimated with. But what they're designed to do is to encapsulate all of the things that feed into an estimate, including the length of time you think it'll take, how complicated it might be to do the task, how many unknowns there are or what the risk is of doing that particular task, and trying to encompass all of that in a single value that everybody on an Agile team can get behind and understand, and something that importantly, when you look at planning a sprint, you can figure out how much work, how much effort you can get into a single iteration, whether that's 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and so on. It's also a good measure then to understand how you are delivering on the things that you have set out to do. So let's understand a little bit about what an Agile story point is. First of all, it's a relative measure. So it's not an absolute measure. An absolute measure is something that is the same at all times. It is the same from one team to another. You know, an hour is an hour, a day is a day. That's an absolute measure. An Agile story point is actually a relative measure. And what it means is that something that is 2 story points is bigger by a factor of 100%, as in it's twice as big, as something that is 1 story point. So I can tell immediately by looking at 2 tasks on a board, if one is 2 points and one is 1 point, the one that's 2 points should be twice as much risk, twice as much effort, twice as much complexity as the one at 1 point. And that's really the whole basis of Agile story points in a nutshell. They are relative metrics, and each one is only relative to the other ones that are in the same backlog. Now, each team needs to define their own story point regime themselves. But a good way of doing this is to sit down with the team and figure out, what does an average task that's really minimal look like? Now, to do that, you need to understand what your definition of done is on your team. So the definition of done is something that we can tackle in another video, but in a nutshell, it just basically means, how do I know that any given story on a board is done? It may be coded, it may be tested, it may have passed the acceptance tests, all of the automated tests may be passing, it has been merged to the main line, it has been deployed into either a test environment or the production environment. Whatever it is that your team agrees means done for a particular story, then a story point, when you come to figure that out, should really reflect the minimal change that you could make to your product, and how much time, complexity, and risk would be involved in doing a very simple change to your product. So let's say, for example, you're working on a website. A very minimal change might be updating the copy on a page. Maybe a simple 1-line change, it may be a copy and paste job from a document that's been provided by someone else, but a copy change might be the simplest piece of work that you could possibly do. Now, to do that copy change within your team, depending on how your definition of done is structured and how your team is structured, you will know what the steps look like. So you'll have to put the card into progress, you'll have to check out that repository or create a new branch or whatever your workflow is, make the actual change. You know, it might be a 10-minute job or something like that for a developer. And then you'll have to check the change in, it might have to go through code review, then it might have to go through QA, and then it'll have to be deployed. So whatever that process would look like for a really small piece of functionality, then settle on that as a story point. Now, what some teams like to do is actually settle on that as 2 story points, because then if you take an average task like that, that's maybe an entire page copy change, it maybe seems a little bit pointless. If your project is quite complicated, it maybe seems a little pointless to make 1 story point be a 1-line change, because in actual fact that's not something that happens very often. And so what you might want to do is make the average story, the average piece of work that you would do, be 2 story points, and that then allows you to have 1 story point represent a half of that effort. But whatever you do, define either 1 story point or 2 story points, and what that would look like for your team to do that. You've then got a yardstick essentially to judge all of the rest of your stories on. So then what you can do is you can sit down when you're estimating tasks, and with that prototype task in mind, you can say, well, Does this task seem to be twice as big as that? You know, does it seem to be 5 times as big as that? You can then get a bit of a sense when you compare to a prototype task what all of the other items in your backlog look like in terms of scale. Now, the 3 things to always bear in mind is a little triangle to bear in mind whenever you're planning your story points. Bear in mind, you need to calculate how much effort will be involved. So in the example I just gave you, the effort is relatively minimal. You're just copying and pasting a piece of text, or you're typing a piece of text into the code and you're checking it in. Remember all of the other steps, you know, so the more complex as well this is, then you have to think about that. But the effort involved in coding it, testing it, deploying it, whatever is necessary for your definition of done is the first piece of the triangle. The second piece is the complexity. So if you are changing a piece of functionality that touches 5 other things, it sends emails, it affects the database structure or something like that, that's much more complex. Making that change could have a knock-on impact on various other things. That's complexity. So although it might still be a 10-minute job to make the change, you might need to think about what other things are going to be impacted by that, what things are we going to have to test, what things do we potentially have to change as a result of this change that we have to make. So complexity is the second factor in your triangle. I've got complexity and I've got the amount of effort involved. Now the third thing, I like to call it risk. Some people also call it the unknowns factor. But basically, when you do a piece of work, you have to figure out, what do I not know about this? If I've never done this before, as in software development, it's very common that you're doing something that either your team has never done before or nobody has ever done before. And so you just don't know what you don't know yet. There's an unknown factor in there, and that's risk. Every unknown is something that could go wrong. It could take longer than planned or estimated. And as well as that, also in the situation where you've got something that's highly complex, that might carry with it additional risk. So for example, if the complexity relates to touching other services, the risk might be you just don't know how those services are going to react when you make this change. That's risk. So the 3 things to bear in mind when you are estimating in story points is effort required, first of all. That might be the time it takes or the amount of people that need to be involved, but it's overall, what is the effort required? The next thing then is the complexity. How complex is it to do this thing? Do we need to involve other teams? Do we need to involve other pieces of software that might need to change? And then finally, what's the risk or what are the unknowns when I'm making this change? And once you factor all of that in, you should be able to come up with an estimate in terms of relative scale to other tasks that you've done, other items on your backlog, that you can say, well, this is twice as risky, but it's the same amount of work. It's, 5 times as complex as that story. That's a 1-pointer. This is 5 times as complex. So very simple calculation, it's going to be a 5-pointer. If we have lots of risk or lots of effort in there, it might go up further. It might go up and maybe it's an 8-pointer. And this brings me then to the factors of scale. Now, I've always used Fibonacci numbers or a slight variation of the Fibonacci sequence when using story points. And the reason for this is that if you use a linear scale where you've got basically the numbers, say 1 to 10, and I can put a story in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10, then it becomes really hard to decide between a 6 and a 7, or a 9 and a 10, or a 1 and a 2. It's really difficult when you've got such a small distance between each place on the scale. And this is where the Fibonacci sequence really helps us. So the difference between a 1 and a 2 is really obvious to people. If this thing is really simple and we reckon this is twice as much work, it's a 2-pointer, it's not a 1-pointer. That's really simple. But the Fibonacci sequence, if you don't know, is 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, and so on. Now, the idea of the Fibonacci sequence is that you add the previous number in the sequence to the current number to get the next number. So we start with 0, for example, we get 0, and then the current number is 1. 1 plus 0 is 1, so therefore the next number is also 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, so the next number is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3, so the next number is 3. And then 3 plus 2 is 5, so the next number is 5, and so on. So we use a slightly modified version. We don't need 2 1s, and we don't need a 0. So we use 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and 21. And generally I don't go beyond 21 because anything beyond 21, you need to break it down further. So the idea would be if you choose a 1 or a 2 as your baseline, as this is a really small task, this is a really simple task, it's a really well-defined task, there's very little risk in it. When you come to estimating then, you want to put your tasks into one of these buckets. So the idea being that if it's a slightly more than a 3, well, it's not a 4. You don't invent a new bucket to put your task in. Decide upon what are the increments that you're going to go to for your team ahead of time. And if it won't fit in bucket 3, put it in bucket 5. It's as simple as that. Yes, it may not feel like it's quite as big as a 5, but if it doesn't fit in 3, it has to go into bucket 5. Similarly, if you've got something that's a 5, 8 seems a long way from 5. But if it's bigger than a 5, it needs to go into an 8-sized bucket. Now, the idea behind this is to force people to really think about their estimates. Is it bigger than a 5? Well, I'd go to a 6. If it's a 5 or a 6, how much bigger is it? But if it's an 8, we know that 8 is significantly bigger than 5. And so it really reinforces this relative scale. It reinforces understanding just how big that task is. And so I would encourage you to adopt the Fibonacci sequence for that reason, and to really think about when you're estimating a task. Look at other tasks that have the similar estimate. So if you're going to come up with a task that's a 5-pointer, look at other items in your backlog that were 5-pointers. Does this item feel like it is as big as those? Does it feel like it's bigger, or it's more complex, or it's more risky? Maybe a 5 isn't right for it. If you feel like it's either more risky or more complex or slightly more effort involved in that, maybe it needs to go up one to an 8. So the important thing here is always go for the next biggest bucket. If it feels like it's just slightly too big for a 5 or a 3 or a 1 or whatever it is, just go for the next biggest bucket. It all evens out eventually. You don't need to nitpick about, I think it's only a 5.5, I'll put it in a 5. If it's bigger, put it in the bigger bucket. It will come out in the wash. Some tasks, they go faster than others. Some tasks go slower than planned, and it will all come out evenly in the end. So that's the gist of estimating. Now, there's lots more to understand about how you actually go about estimating tasks. But if you take away anything from this video, the important points are that when you're estimating, you want to estimate based on 3 factors. They are effort. How much time is involved in you doing that? How many people need to get involved? How much work do you need to do? Complexity. How many different things are going to be impacted by this? How many different things need to change? And then finally, risk or unknowns. What are the things that I don't know about in this task? Use a non-linear scale to choose your story points. Ideally, the Fibonacci sequence works really well. If you come up with something else, that's fine. But you want to have more than a single step between most of the numbers in your scale, so that it's really easy to define, no, it's not a 5, it goes into an 8. No, it's definitely not an 8, it's much bigger than that, it goes into a 13. It's much easier to do that if you choose big gaps in your scale, and a scale like the Fibonacci sequence works really well for that. And then remember all the time that these numbers are relative and they are defined by the team. This is the most important part about story points. They are the team's judgment of relative effort, complexity and risk. And one team's 3-pointer might be another team's 5-pointer, might be another team's 1-pointer. It's completely up to the team. So if you're working on a Scrum team or you're working on an Agile team that's using these story points at all, remember that it's down to the team. If you don't feel like the points fit your team, if you don't feel like the points fit the way you work, then sit down with your team, plan a new way of estimating with those points, make your points mean something that means something to your team. And I'll see you next time.